All right, everyone, welcome back. Today we are going to be talking about Microeconomics, Chapter 8. And this is going to be perfect competition. So, if you want to go ahead and pull out your notes that I have provided in the files file on Canvas, pull those out and I'll sort of walk you through them. This will be a pretty short one. This is a pretty easy chapter. And then I'll have Chapter 9 up this week as well. So, I'm also going to provide an updated syllabus. I was supposed to do that last week and it sort of slipped my mind. So just push everything back a week, like I said. It'll remain exactly the same. We'll just move it back a week for winter weather. So anyway, here we go. Microeconomics, Chapter 8, Perfect Competition. In Section 1, we're going to talk about perfect competition and why it matters. So there are 4 conditions for perfect competition. One, many different firms have to produce identical products, right? So this is pens, and you can't just have 1 or 2 firms. It can't be a monopoly or an oligopoly. You have to have lots and lots of competition, and they have to be producing the same product. So we're just sort of setting the assumptions for what we're about to talk about. And one of them is that there's lots of firms, and they're all producing the same thing theoretically. 2, many buyers are available to purchase the product, and many sellers are there to sell it, right? So it's not sort of a luxury good. We're not talking about yachts, things like that. So there's lots of competition in the market on the firm side, and there's a lot of demand from multiple purchasers on the demand side. Number 3, sellers and buyers have all of the relevant information to make rational decisions about the products that they are buying and selling. This is one of the biggest problems in economics, but since we're talking theoretical and we're just walking through some theoretical models and their implications, we are going to assume that it is a 100% information environment, right? This is not the reality in most of the world and in most of economic interactions, either between individuals or firms or on the larger market, or even for like hedge funds, right? They don't have perfect information. They're making rational guesses on the information that they have collected in the instantaneous term. But this is a really difficult assumption to sort of prove into in the real world, right? Which is why we're going to stick to the theoretical. Okay, and the 4th condition is that firms are allowed to leave and enter the market without any restrictions, right? And we'll talk about this being difficult in the short term. You can't just like close up shop and walk away, right now because you've put some sunk costs into your firm. But there is an assumption that, at least in the long term, you can sort of just close up shop and walk away, or you can start up a business and walk in when it becomes advantageous to do that, right? Okay. So, in this chapter, we're going to be talking about price takers. And these are firms which basically cannot affect the price of goods on the market, right? So this is, they keep using the example of farmers. Farmers don't really have a lot of influence on the price of their goods. The same with ranchers, right? A head of cattle is a head of cattle, and the market decides what the price is, not the rancher himself. And so, under these conditions of perfect competition, these firms are price takers. They cannot influence the market. They can't influence the price. Increasing or decreasing supply has no real effect on the market because there's so many firms in the market already, which is one of our assumptions, remember. And so, under these conditions of perfect competition, the firm is the price taker, okay? All right, so we're going to move on to section 8.2. How perfectly competitive firms make output decisions, right? And here, you'll need to read through this chapter pretty closely. There's a lot of sort of mathematical pieces, but I really like the graphics because they make everything very clear, especially once you read through the sort of terminology one or two times, the graphics start to really kick in, and you go, oh, okay, that makes sense, right? So here we are a firm, and we're deciding how many packs of raspberries we want to pack up and sell on the market, right? And I'm guessing we're like a local farmer. We could sell it by the side of the road or to a grocery store or something, right? So remember, if you go over to the y-axis, it always starts above zero, right? Because we have some costs. Maybe we have a truck that we have to pay for to get stuff to the market. We're going to have to pay for the water and the nutrients necessary to grow the raspberries, the time that we put in, maybe pruning or picking aphids off the leaves. I don't know. It's silly, I know. Okay, so you always have a sunk cost is my point, right? And so we never have a zero cost here, which is very important later in the chapter when we're deciding whether we want to enter or leave the market, right? And so if we look here, where it connects to the y-axis, right at around, I guess, 60 or something, it stays flat generally, and then it curves up. Remember, and that's because of our marginal returns that we talked about, diminishing marginal returns that we talked about maybe in chapter 2 and in the chapter before this one, right? So the more that you want to produce, right, you can't just produce infinitely and there's no diminishing return, right? The more that you produce, the more it's going to start to cost you because now you got to hire, labor, these sorts of things. Maybe you're bumping up against, the size of land that you could even logistically control. So as we start to produce more and more and more, those total costs are going to start to increase more and more and more, and that's our diminishing return. Your revenue always stays flat, which is why the revenue line is here, because remember, the seller can't affect the price of goods. And so the price of a case of raspberries is always $4. So no matter how many we produce into infinitum, they will cost $4. So your line will always be flat. Here, down at the very bottom, right, you have your profit line. And this is sort of a mirror image of your cost line. And so what's happening is, again, if you go back to the y-axis, you see that your profit line is below zero always. And that is a mirror of that sunk cost. You have to have, to start a business, you need equipment and things, and so you have a cost already before you even start producing. And so this profit line shows you that you're losing out right there. And so if you follow the total cost line, the profit eventually will cross over the zero, which is excellent, right? As a producer, you want to make a profit. And so you cross over the zero line, and that's where you've covered all your costs. And then it starts to increase, but then eventually when you get that diminishing marginal return, it drops. And so you want to find the sweet spot in that little sort of semicircle up there where the profits are above zero, right? And that means that you want to produce, it looks like, anywhere between 75 to 80 units of raspberries to get your perfect profit, right? That sweet spot, that equilibrium profit. Profit maximization, I guess. All right, so does that make sense? We've got our revenue line remains completely flat. Our total costs are sort of flat over time, but then increasing dramatically at the higher ends of production. And then our profit line is sort of an exact mirror of that. And what we want to find is that sweet spot, that weird little fin-looking piece where our total costs are below our total revenues, and inside of that little sweet spot is where we find our profit, and that's where we want to be as a firm, right? Okay, moving on. All right. The next graph, figure 8.3, is just a new way of picturing the above, right? So our $4 cost per unit is the red dotted line. And it never changes. Again, our firm, no matter how much we produce, we cannot affect the cost of the good. And so we're a price taker, as we talked above. And so $4 per unit across the board, no matter what, is what we're going to get back in revenue. And so this blue bubbled line is your marginal cost. How much is it going to cost as you're increasing the number of products being made, right? And that drops for a while, and then it starts to rise back up. And this is because of sunk costs and marginal returns, like we talked about. And your profit maximizing point, like we talked about above, is this 75 to 80. And here it says it's exactly 80. And it's so this is a good way to find out what the exact number is, whereas we were sort of eyeballing it in figure 8.1. In figure 8.3, it shows you your profit maximization point is at 80 packs of raspberries. That's where we'll get our absolute maximum profit. And then after that, our costs start to rise dramatically, so we don't want to produce any more than that. Excuse me. Okay, so at this point, we start discussing in the chapter, we have a consideration to make as a firm. If we're not profiting, which at sometimes does happen, imagine a farmer where suddenly there's a glut on the market of, say, I don't know, you're a Brussels sprout farmer, right? And suddenly Brussels has a huge crop of Brussels sprouts this year. For some reason, their yield is way off. And so the Brussels sprout price in the market drops. And as a farmer, I'm not even making enough to profit, right? So I have to make a decision at this point. I already have some sunk costs. We're in the short-term rationalization period for a business. We're not in the long term where we can affect our sunk costs. And so I have to decide, do I want to just shut down the whole process this year and maybe even just close the firm, or do I want to keep producing, minimize my losses, and hope for a better future? Do I want to stick with this industry? And like they say here at the shutdown point, sometimes it is better to continue operating at a loss than it is to completely shut down. And that's because you've already paid your sunk costs, so maybe we can limp along this year and get back to profitability in the next year. It happens all the time for companies, right? Because you're working at a razor-thin margin. And the book quote says, the intersection of the variable average cost curve and the marginal cost curve, which shows the price below which the firm would lack enough revenue to cover its variable costs. So if we go down to figure 8.6, right? Again, there's a big, long discussion of how all of this works, but I'll try to sort of walk you through the graph here. Okay, so our average variable cost needs to be above our marginal cost for us to make any money. In the first, the price is above the average variable cost, right? Let me find myself here. Okay, yes. In the first, the marginal cost is below the average variable cost up to about 60 packs of raspberries. So above that, we're making a huge loss, and we have to sort of just step away from the market. And if you look at figure 8.7, profit, loss, and shutdown, this graph is really nice because it sort of shows you each piece. You have your marginal cost, right? And this is the additional cost per additional unit created, right? And so your marginal cost is going to drop, right, as you start to work through some of those sunk costs, but then again, due to diminishing marginal returns, as you start producing at the far ends, your marginal costs are going to increase dramatically. Your average variable cost, again, is the cost per additional unit. Again, this is going to do the same thing. This is largely the reason for the marginal cost increasing so dramatically. So if you are producing below the average variable cost, you're losing money hand over fist. Like, you're not even covering your initial operating costs. And at that point, you're at this very bottom shutdown zone. Like, you need to shut down your company. You're not only not covering the average variable cost, but you're not covering the sunk costs of your factory, your labor, etc. It's time to get out, right? If you are between the average variable cost and the average cost, you're losing, but at least you're covering your sunk costs. And so you can sort of limp on to the next year. You're not making a profit. You're even losing a small margin. But at least you're covering your sunk costs, and you can pay for your factory, whatever. And then finally, once you get past that break-even zone of output, and you're above the average cost, you start to profit. Okay, section 8.3. Do we want to enter or exit the market? So we're going to move on from the short term, where we can't really affect our sunk or our sunk costs, to the long term, where we can affect our sunk costs. And at this point, we can decide whether we want to leave the market or enter the market if suddenly demand increases, right? And suddenly there's a profit to be made, you'll see companies flooding in. If demand drops and you start seeing companies making a loss, you'll see firms drop out of the market. And this is why you get sort of an equilibrium firm size where your profit is basically zero, right? And we'll talk about some of that. What's happening here is there's a natural pull in a market system where if there's profit to be made in the system, right? Like I mentioned, if demand increases suddenly, and now we're making a profit as a firm, you'll see a flood of new firms enter the market. Does that make sense? There's a profit to be made, right? And so you'll see a flood of new firms enter the market to try to fill that void, to make some profit. Unfortunately, what this does is, as you add more and more and more product into the system, you start to meet that demand, you come up to an equilibrium set, and now your profit is back to zero. And so everyone is operating at an equilibrium of zero, right? Theoretically. Of course, there's always going to be some profit or some loss, but this is the theory that there's profit in the system. New companies are going to flood in to soak up some of that profit. It'll pop the equilibrium back to zero, where you're just covering your costs, your total costs, your sunk costs, your average variable costs, your average costs, all of it, and you'll come to a zero equilibrium point. If in the market there's suddenly a loss, right? There's a glut of product, or demand is reduced in the long term, and suddenly companies are making a loss. You will see companies exit the system. This will reduce the products in the system, or the supply, right? Which eventually will increase the revenue for each company that's left, and it will bring you back to an equilibrium zero profit point. Okay? So everything's always balancing out. If there's profit in the system, companies will flood in, bring it back down to a zero equilibrium. If there's loss in the system, companies will flood out and bring it back up to an equilibrium zero, right? Okay. So, given that, they want you to know that there are three industry types. You have a constant cost industry, an increasing cost industry, and a decreasing cost industry. And if you look at figure 8.8, you can see what the implications are for each of these, right? So in the first, where you have constant costs, you can see that demand increases suddenly from D1 to D2, but there are constant costs in the system, and so the supply matches. Supply shifts out from S1 to S2, and you get a new equilibrium point, which shifts from Q1 to Q2. Now, because costs are constant, there's no real friction in the system, and so the supply increase is exactly the same as the demand increase. You see that? So demand increases, supply increases equivalently because there's no cost friction in the system. Now, if you have increasing costs, as demand increases from D1 to D2, which is exactly the same on each chart, keep that in mind. The demand increase is always the same. You move from D1 to D2. Unfortunately, the price of producing those goods increases as production ramps up because of marginal return losses. And so your supply increases from S1 to S2, but because there are new costs in the system, the supply does not match the demand that was pumped into the system. So now prices are going to increase. The supply doesn't match the demand, and you have profit in the system. With decreasing costs, you'll see that as demand increases from D1 to D2, equivalent to the other charge, as we're making more products, it actually costs less because we're getting some sort of diminishing costs over time, right? Maybe we're buying in bulk, so it's costing us less. Quantity in the system, the supply will move from S1 to S2, but because costs are dropping, the supply in the system will outpace the new demand, and so products will cost a lot less on the market. All right, that's pretty much it for this chapter. It was a pretty smooth one. We're talking about perfect competition. You want to be able to find the sweet spot in profit. Understand why firms enter and exit the market, and understand sort of that equilibrium automatic shifting point where costs affect whether new companies come into or out of the market. So good luck. Have a wonderful day. Glad the weather has cleared up some, and I'll get some more content up today. Stay safe and stay happy.